Thank you everyone for coming this evening, and thank you so much to the Florida Historical Society for inviting me. Today I'm going to be talking about a site that's really close to my heart because this is the site that all of my thesis work came from, which for those of you who've written a thesis know that that's something that takes a lot of time and a lot of patience and love. So I'm going to be talking about this site today, and just to give you kind of an outline of where we're going for this talk, I'm going to give you some background on some of the terminology I'm going to use so we have the same frame of reference moving forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Dakhleh Oasis project, which is the main research body that's been doing work at the site of Kellis. I'm going to give a brief historical overview of Kellis as we know so far. And then I'm going to go, for the bulk of my talk, into the bioarchaeological research that's been done at Kellis. From there, I'm going to give a brief case study of some work that I've done with my thesis advisor on two really interesting cases from two skeletons that we've found at the site. So just to discuss some of the terminology I'm going to be using, I've used one of these words already, bioarchaeology. And what this term means, briefly, is it's the study of the human past from the human skeleton. This can also, of course, refer to other aspects of human remains, tissue, hair, other things like that. But it is a subfield of anthropology, and it falls right between biological anthropology and archaeology, so it fits right in between those two things. A subfield of bioarchaeology that I'll be discussing as well is paleopathology. Paleopathology is simply the study of ancient disease, and this usually takes the human skeleton as a starting point, but can also use other human tissues as well. So the Dakhleh Oasis project, as I mentioned, is the main research institution that has been doing work at the site of Kellis and in the Dakhleh Oasis more broadly, which I'll discuss the relationship between Kellis and the Dakhleh Oasis in a bit. This research endeavor really encompasses researchers from many countries, universities, different subfields, and it began in the late 1970s with the goal of looking at human adaptation in the Dakhleh Oasis in all of its forms. It was looking at the environment, at faunal analysis, human adaptation, anything you can think of. So it wasn't really until the 1980s that work at Kellis began, and most of this early stuff was pretty preliminary, and so excavation didn't take place until the late 1980s. These early excavations gave us a really good foundation for understanding what we were dealing with at Kellis. This was more traditional archaeology. We're talking artifacts, architectural features, more broad-scale archaeological excavation. It wasn't until the 1990s that we actually started to look at the human skeletons from the site. And this was really exciting because we have a lot of them. What's really fantastic about this work is that one of the researchers, Dr. Tasha Dupre, actually later, after she began working on this project, came to the University of Central Florida. And with her, she brought a lot of these research contacts and the amazing opportunity to do research at this site. Since that time, researchers from the University of Central Florida have been instrumental in the ongoing bioarchaeological research at this site. So as promised, here's a map. As you can see from the red circle at the top there, this is Egypt, okay? And so Kellis is in Egypt. But more specifically, Kellis is located in the Dakhleh Oasis. So as you can see, the Dakhleh Oasis is an oasis in the southern western area of Egypt. And the oasis is an interesting situation because it is located quite a distance from the Nile, as you can see here. In ancient times, this would probably have been about a week in terms of travel time. What's also interesting is because of its distance from the Nile, it was a very arid region. Egypt doesn't get a lot of rain to begin with, but when you're out in the Sahara, you get even less rain. But what's fantastic about this area, and you could probably have guessed it from the word oasis, is that there's an abundance of water available in underground aquifers. What this means is, even though there was very minimal rainfall, these people had plenty of water resources. What that suggests is that they had the availability of plants and animal resources that aren't available in any other area of this desert. This led to really early occupation at the site and very early adoption of agriculture as well. So this is Kellis as we know it thus far. These are all of the areas that have been excavated. As you can see, most of it is administrative and architectural features, but we do have some tombs and some cemeteries which are not on this map that I'll discuss in greater detail. So as I said, the Dakhleh Oasis has been inhabited for probably thousands and thousands of years because it was such a great natural environment. But Kellis itself, which is a small city or settlement, it's a contentious topic whether or not it's a city, so I'm going to refer to it as a settlement. This settlement wasn't permanently inhabited until the Ptolemaic period. And the Ptolemaic period refers to the period in ancient Egypt when Greece and the Greek Empire kind of controlled most of the administrative functions in Egypt. So that's kind of the 1st century BCE as I have up here, and that ended about the 1st century CE. After that, the Roman Empire took over Egypt, and Kellis continued to be inhabited even under the Roman period until about the 4th century CE. Now, we don't know exactly why Kellis was abandoned. Some theories, however, have suggested that environmental degradation may have played a really big part in that. Now, as I mentioned, environmental degradation might have influenced the abandonment of this site. And one way we know that is because currently, as the site stands, it's very, very arid. Like I said, very little rainfall, very little natural humidity in the area. But on top of that, we have a large amount of wind-blown sand. So in Egypt, as I'm sure you guys have seen from pictures and things like that, there are a lot of sand dunes in certain parts of the desert. In Kellis and in the Dakhleh Oasis, at certain times, these dunes have moved very quickly because of either aridity, lack of vegetation, whatever. But the point is that that's really bad for habitation. If your fields are getting covered over by windblown sand, or your homes or anything that you're trying to build is getting covered by windblown sand, you don't want to live there. And as unfortunate as that is for people, it's really great for archaeology. Because what that means is, when these people abandon something or they leave something on the ground, it almost immediately gets covered with sand. And this is really great for a number of reasons. First, that means there's very little water getting to these things. We know that water can really have a very damaging effect, especially on organic remains. And secondly, it protects these things and keeps them safe from scavengers, animals and humans, and keeps it cool with a good airflow, and these things can preserve very, very well. And at Kellis, we have some really fantastic examples of really wonderful preservation. And remember, the site is almost 2,000 years old. So what we have here, I don't know if you can see this, this is almost a 2,000-year-old bed or mat. So these are organic plant fibers that were left in place when the site was abandoned, with some ceramic material also left in place that was covered over and remained in situ. This is almost completely intact. That's pretty amazing. We also have evidence of things being left just as they were when these people abandoned the sites. They left their pots and pans and they just got covered over. And when we uncover them now, we can find these things in what we call in situ. So in context, just the way they were left. In addition to the really fantastic organic remains, we have really wonderful wall paintings. There's one site that I'm not going to unfortunately have time to talk about today that has a number of these really brilliant and vibrant wall paintings remaining. So one reason this preservation is really helpful to archaeologists is that there are actually 2 remaining texts that have been found at the site. Remembering again, this is almost 2,000 years old, it's pretty amazing that we have textual sources available from this time period in this context. So as you can see in this image, these were written on wooden planks, and they were found at the site in situ, just like that. The first is really fantastic. It's called the Kellis Agricultural Account Book. And what this is it's a record of an individual's estate, and it pretty much is his day-to-day dealings with his estate. What came in, what went out, how much he paid for them, how much he had, and it gives us a great idea of what was being grown at the site, what was being traded, and what the value of different elements were. The other one is a bit more fun, if maybe a little bit less directly useful in terms of reconstructing ancient lifeways, but it's actually a child's school book. So it's a copy of the Isocrates text, which is a Greek text. It's actually one of, if not the earliest example of the Isocrates text. And we think that it's probably either a child's school book or somebody who wasn't as literate as maybe the experts in these topics might have been, because there are some mistakes, there are some scratch outs, there's places where things have been rewritten. So it's really interesting to look at that and think about the person who wrote it almost 2,000 years ago. So the amazing preservation at the site also allows us the opportunity to understand a little bit more about the traditions at the site that we might not have from other sources or other places. And one of these things is the fact that Kellis was on the fringes of this empire. As I said, it was almost 7 or 8 days from the Nile. And looking at the archaeological evidence, we can tell that those people really used their position on the fringes to their advantage. So they picked and chose which new cultural topics, which new traditions they wanted to incorporate, and made kind of an interesting hybrid at the site, and that they could call as their own. And so the first example, during the Ptolemaic period, we have really fantastic examples from these wall paintings of the mixing of pharaonic or traditional Egyptian elements with Greek elements. So if you can see here at the top, this is a traditional Egyptian frieze. We have the feet pointed one way. It looks like there's a number of individuals in a progression. But down here, we have geometric design. Geometric design is much more indicative of Greek period art. So these two elements in the same panel, probably in a temple, indicates that once again they were mixing, picking, and choosing the traditions. Another way we can tell this is that we have very late use temples at the site. So Christianity came in right at the end of the Roman Empire, so probably around the 3rd century CE. But we have temples that were in use far past that. At the same time, we have two of the earliest used churches in Egypt at Kellis. So again, these people were picking and choosing which elements of the traditional or the dominant narrative that they wanted to incorporate, and not everybody was doing it at the exact same rate or time. Looking at, again, these influence of these larger empires, we can look to what was being grown or made at the site. And so from the Great Preservation, we have evidence that these individuals were growing things for their own consumption, for animal fodder, but also for use in things like perfumes and spices. With Roman rule came a few changes that really helped develop this settlement as a productive trade center. And this was the oxen-driven water wheel, or the sakia, which I have an image of here at the bottom, which really allowed year-round access to these underground aquifers, no matter what the water level was. And the second is that it offered up new markets that had never been available. So what that meant was not only did Kellis have new markets to expand into, but it was also getting introduced to new animals, plants, different supplies and objects that they could then incorporate into their own systems of agriculture. And so what's really interesting is that because of the unique environment of the Dakhleh Oasis, a lot of these agricultural elements that were coming from the Mediterranean was really well suited to the Dakhleh Oasis. So things like different exotic, which I have written down here, different exotic plants like peaches and apples were really well suited to this environment where it was arid, but there was plenty of water. So it really became a thriving trade center during this period because it could expand into those markets. At the same time, Kellis was a productive industrial center. We have evidence of weaving, as you can see here with these amazing examples. We have cotton, other plant fibers that were woven into sandals and baskets and mats. Ceramics were also a very important aspect of this economy, not only for domestic use, but also to transport goods for sale. And lastly, we have evidence of metalworking at the site of different copper and copper alloys. And what we can tell from analyzing these different trade goods when we find them at the site is that Kellis had far-ranging trade networks, not only to the Nile Valley, but also all the way up to the Mediterranean and as far south as Sudan. So I think that puts Kellis in context for now, and what we're going to talk about now is more of an individual perspective. And the best way to get an individual perspective on people who lived at a site is through bioarchaeology, which, like I said, is the study of the human skeleton. So the researchers through the Dakhleh Oasis project that study the bones are primarily from the University of Central Florida, and they have been affectionately dubbed the Bone Team. Now, the Bone Team, as you can see from this diagram, has a number of different foci in their research, but what I'm going to talk about today is going to be children, mortuary analysis, pathology, and bone isotopes. So in order to study skeletons, we need to find them. And the first place that we find skeletons at Kellis is in the Kellis 1 cemetery. And so the Kellis 1 cemetery is the earlier of the two cemeteries that we have at the site. It's probably from the Ptolemaic period, which we can tell here because we have these beautiful cartonnage sarcophagi, and we have evidence of anthropogenic or human-induced mummification practices. So that leads us to believe that it was still during the more traditional Egyptian periods of use of the site. At the same time, we have very few juveniles in this cemetery, which really reinforces the fact that it was probably more of a traditional Egyptian cemetery. The second cemetery, which is a bit larger and we have a lot more individuals and more research has been done on, is the Kellis 2 cemetery. Now this one's a little bit more interesting. It's unclear right now how these two cemeteries interacted in terms of chronology. Some have suggested that the first cemetery went out of use and then the second cemetery came into use. But recent radiocarbon dates suggest that it might be a bit more complicated. This is interesting because the style of burial, as you can see here, is much different in this cemetery. We have no evidence of anthropogenic mummification. Instead, what we have is what has been dubbed traditional Christian style of burial. So we have individuals placed here on their back in an east-west orientation, no grave goods, but the only occasional mortuary artifacts that we have would be some sort of tomb infrastructure. So here we have a stone-lined pit with a stone superstructure. That's pretty much all you'll find with these burials. Another interesting thing that further reinforces that this might be a Christian-style cemetery is the fact that there are many juveniles at this site. What's fantastic about this is that because of the great preservation that I talked about before, many of these juveniles are still available for study, which, if you know anything about bioarchaeology, is really rare. Juvenile skeletons don't survive well in the archaeological record. They're usually very small, very fragile, and they just don't preserve as well as adult bones. At the same time, in many cultures, juveniles are not interred in the same fashion as adult remains. So for many cultures, we don't have juvenile remains to study at all. So to have this many at Kellis is a really fantastic opportunity to gain more understanding of children and childhood. But before we go on to that, the other places where we find skeletons in Kellis are in the tombs. So as I showed you this map a little bit before, the north tombs are up here, and those are the later, probably, of the two tombs. These date to the Romano-Christian period, so the very end of occupation at this site. And they kind of look like this. They're large superstructures made of stone. The problem is that the chronology gets a little bit complicated because these were family tombs, and they were used multiple times. The same is said for the south tombs. So if somebody was interred, and then a few generations later somebody else wanted to be interred, sometime the original person would just be moved over. Or the original people would be burned and then moved over, or a new floor level would be put down. So it gets very complicated trying to understand how all these people were interred, and then even in the south tombs, we don't really even understand the chronology of use of the tomb at this time. So as I said, one of the main foci of the Dakhleh Oasis project and the bone team specifically is the study of children, because we really have fantastic examples here. The main areas of research for children that we're able to look at, which is very unique, as I said, is looking at congenital defects, stress, birth trauma, and other forms of childhood trauma. And these images, I just wanted to stress to you the excellent preservation that we have at the site. Here we have a fetus that was just at term, and you can see here we actually have the umbilical cord still tied off. And over here, we have two infants of the same age, and one's male and one's female, which we can tell from the soft tissue. They died very close to birth, and the fact that they were interred together has led researchers to suggest that they might be fraternal twins that died at the time of birth. Of course, we would probably need more evidence to say if they were related to that extent in terms of DNA or something like that. So one of the main amazing things that we can look at from these juvenile remains is the distribution of congenital defects in the population. So one example that we have here is a condition known as anencephaly. So in anencephaly, the brain fails to form in the same way that it would in a healthy individual, and these infants usually don't survive to term. So for example, we have here, this is an anencephalic skull. As you can see, in comparison to this normal skull, the frontal bone hasn't developed almost at all. And that unfortunately suggests that the brain has also not developed and this person would not have survived. Another congenital defect that we find is the one over on the far end, and this is osteogenesis imperfecta. That's a fancy term for brittle bone syndrome. And what this means is that these cells that are responsible for producing bone in the body are malformed or don't work exactly as they're supposed to. This makes the bone more fragile, less likely to heal, and if it does heal, doesn't heal properly or normally. So as you can see from this example, we have a fracture, we have a bent bone that healed improperly, and we have another bent bone up here. From these juveniles, we can also look at different forms of stress that might have been facing children at this period. So I'll start with birth trauma for this one. Over here, we have an example of a fractured clavicle. Both of these are fractured clavicles. And at the bottom, we have examples of fractured humeral heads, so the bone up here on your shoulder. These are two examples, and this is also an example of a fractured humerus that never grew to its full length because of its early fracture. Now, in clinical literature, so in modern medical studies, these injuries are very indicative of different traumatic events during childbirth. So if a child is too wide to fit through the birth canal, sometimes in attempting to come out of the birth canal, the clavicle or the collarbone or the shoulders might dislocate or be fractured. This is also could happen if a midwife is attempting to help the child along a little bit too roughly. So the fact that these are still present here, but you can also tell that they had really long-term consequences for some of these individuals, because as you can see here, that bone never actually grew to its normal size. So that's something interesting we can look at. At the same time, we can look at childhood stress. So in this individual, you can see kind of this porous, almost honeycomb structure. This is called cribra or Battaglia. And this is what we'd refer to in bioarchaeology as a non-specific indicator of health. And what this means is we know this person was sick, but we don't really know why. Most research has suggested it's probably related to some form of anemia, but we can't say for sure whether that's a result of dietary deficiency, other health conditions, or genetic. But we can tell that this individual was probably unhealthy at the time of their death because it is still an active lesion. Over here, we have very bent children's bones. This is oftentimes indicative of rickets. Rickets is a vitamin D deficiency. That's a very uncommon find in Egypt, considering sunlight is really plentiful. So this is either suggestive that this child might have suffered from some other condition that prevented its proper incorporation of vitamin D, or that something else is going on here. But in either case, it's likely related to some sort of health stress. The last thing that we can look at in terms of trauma to juveniles is we can actually look at the incidence of multiple repeated childhood traumatic events. Now, in the modern clinical medical literature, child abuse can be identified in children by repeated traumatic events or repeated injuries in different stages of healing. And that's exactly what we found in this individual. This is a 2 to 3-year-old individual from Kellis 2. And what we have here is we have evidence of multiple fractures. These are just a few. We have both humeral, upper humeri, a clavicle, some damage to the scapula, and all of these injuries were in different stages of healing. This suggests to us that this child experienced multiple different traumatic events. The bilateral humeral fractures, so the symmetrical fractures to the upper arms, are consistent with modern clinical evidence of shaken baby syndrome, where an individual is grasped by the upper arm and shaken violently. So all of this evidence together suggests to us that some sort of repeated trauma, possibly what we would dub modernly as child abuse, might have been inflicted upon this child. However, it's difficult for us to say that about a past society when we don't necessarily know what was happening or how they perceived children to begin with. But this does offer us some unique insight into the treatment of children, especially in a period, like I said, of change during the Roman period. To date, this is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, evidence of child abuse in the archaeological record. But like I said, children don't show up very often in the archaeological record. Okay, so moving away from juveniles, another main focus of research in the Dakhleh Oasis is other mortuary elements. So in this case, we've been looking at the analysis of hair. Because preservation at the site is so fantastic, what you can see from here is that we actually have full heads of hair preserved on skeletons. And not only are they preserved, they're preserved in their hairstyles. One of the researchers at the University of Central Florida has been using the Fayum mortuary portraits, which is here. These are mortuary portraits that were painted at or around the time of death during the Greco and the Roman period. And she's comparing these hairstyles to hairstyles from these portraits. First, you can see here that these ones kind of line up. If you see these kind of short curls in the front and the fact that her hair is all the way pulled back, so this suggests this might be a similar style. And the fact that Kellis, which was, like I said, almost 8 days from the Nile, was still really on trend is suggestive that this was an important administrative center that had close ties to the rest of the empire. Elemental analysis of hair has also revealed a lot of information about what they did in terms of styling. So we have evidence of use of different citruses and almonds in terms of hair care and cleaning. These actually maintain not only like shine and things like that, but also prevent bacterial and fungal growth. And then we have evidence of indigo, myrrh, and henna use, which was actually used to dye the hair. Now, these things are really interesting because we have evidence of not only living people dyeing their hair, but we have evidence that people's hair were dyed after death. And we can tell this, first off, because we can look at how much the hair has grown since the time of dye. And if it hasn't grown at all, it's probably very, very close to the time of death, if not after. So what this tells us that either these features of the appearance were so important to identity that they had to be in place for the individual to have a successful afterlife, or that these were just cosmetic elements that they wanted their bodies to look as good in death or something like that. So the other realm that is a main focus of research with the Dakhleh Oasis project in terms of skeletal analysis is isotopic analysis. This is a very brief rundown of isotopic analysis. This is what I did my thesis on, so I can write 40 pages on it, but I will do one slide for now. Isotopic analysis refers to the measurement of different types of elements in human tissue. And what this means is each element in your body, well, most elements have a heavy and a light form. If we can measure the ratio of those in human tissues, we can compare that to different animal and plant tissues and see what those people were eating. So for example, plants have different methods of incorporating carbon from the atmosphere. So we have C3 plants, such as wheat, potato, soybean. They incorporate carbon one way, so they'll have a different ratio. And then we have C4 plants, like wheat and millet, and those will incorporate carbon in another way. So they will have different ratios. If we then compare a human signature, we can tell if they were eating primarily C3 or C4 plants. Nitrogen is a fair bit more complicated, but the basic gist of nitrogen is that it increases as you move up the food chain. So you have a heavy and a light form of nitrogen again, and so plants will have the lightest form, and as you move up the food chain, the apex predators will have the highest amount of nitrogen. And this is interesting because you can look at humans and you can see if they were eating primarily plants or animals, and if it was animals, whether it was carnivorous protein, so they were eating some sort of carnivore animals, or if they were eating omnivores or herbivores. However, nitrogen is complicated because it can be influenced by a number of other factors, including the individual's health. So to talk about health and nitrogen, because we have such excellent preserved hair, researchers at the University of Central Florida have been actually tracking health and diet on a month-to-month basis prior to these individuals' deaths. So for this individual, this female, we have her hair from about approximately 14 months prior to death. And what we can tell is that she's living a relatively healthy lifestyle, eating primarily C3 plants, and healthy in terms of her nitrogen levels. But at about 9 months prior to death, we have a big drop off in nitrogen. And what this suggests is that there's some sort of metabolic stress going on. We can't necessarily say what it is, but we know that something is influencing the body and the body is reacting to it. What's interesting is at the same time we have a concurrent drop in carbon values. So this indicates she's going from C3 to C4 plants. Now, historically, C4 plants, including things like millet, have been used during times of illness, during times of weaning, because they're easy to prepare, they're easy to consume, and easy to digest. So what this has been tentatively suggested as, this individual was stressed and they consumed some sort of illness food because they couldn't consume normal heavy foods. But the fact that this little drop in their carbon lasts about 3 months, and the nitrogen actually lasts about 9 months. This has been interpreted possibly as nitrogen or metabolic stress associated with pregnancy and a compound carbon dietary shift as a result of morning sickness. Unfortunately, as we can see here, this individual died right at the end of those 9 months. So whether we can say this individual died in childbirth might be stretching it, but it's certainly one possibility given the isotopic values. Another way we look at stress and pathological conditions in an ancient society is to actually look at the bones themselves. So this is an interesting one. We actually have what is a giant kidney stone over here on this individual. That's really interesting because, as I said, we have abundant water available at the Dakhleh Oasis and in Kellis in particular, and kidney stones are usually associated with chronic dehydration. So this brings up some interesting questions about other factors that might be involved. Other conditions that have been found at Kellis are skeletal conditions that are very suggestive of leprosy. And so what we have here is we actually have bone resorption. So the bones of the front of the face, so of the maxilla and the sinuses, have actually been resorbed, so they're gone. And then we also have resorption of parts of the toes over here. And this is very suggestive of leprosy, as we see it in other cases. Another point of stress that we see is traumatic events. So this is a really interesting one because what we have here is you can see a normal femur here, and you can see the pathological femur here. This was an older woman, probably in her 60s, and she suffered a hip fracture. What's interesting is she survived the hip fracture, but she clearly was still using it to a certain extent because it healed abnormally. So it's not completely healed, but it's healed enough, and it's healed in the wrong place, which suggests that it wasn't immobilized, and this woman possibly was walking around on her broken hip long enough for it to heal the way that it did. What's fascinating is we have the hair of this individual to compare her nitrogen values. And remember I said nitrogen can be equated with health. So what we have here is that approximately 12 months, 11 months prior to death, we have a huge drop in nitrogen values. This wouldn't be surprising if an individual had suffered a severe injury and because of that maybe had gotten an infection or some other problem associated with that injury. What you can see as well is we have a continuous decline in carbon values as well, which could suggest, again, a move to C4 plants because of illness. Now, one thing I will point out is that although we see a rise in nitrogen again, this could be suggestive that she was getting better, that the illness was passing and she was returning to her normal nitrogen state. It's also possible that in times of severe stress, the body will kind of pull out all the stops. It'll release all of its nitrogen stores in an attempt to fight off the disease or maintain the metabolic position that it's in. And so this could actually just indicate that she was getting sicker, and unfortunately, she did die right about that time. So again, we can't say that this event was directly correlated with her hip fracture, but they certainly could have been, especially given the amount of healing that we see in it. Now I'm going to discuss an interesting case of pathological conditions that I got the chance to research with my thesis advisor, and these examples come from the North Tombs. So as I said, that's up here, and we're going to be looking from North Tomb 1, which is at the bottom of that complex. These are just some more examples of the North Tombs. As I said, they're family tombs, likely. They were in use for multiple generations, and they're very large structures. So our two individuals, or some more examples of the type of interments that you'd find in these tombs. And our two individuals come from the same room in the same tomb, which to us suggests probably some sort of familial relationship. So the first one is burial 10. This is a older male between the ages of 40 and 50. And what we can see, well, at least from these images, is that he had severe degenerative changes in most of his joints. Elbows, shoulders, knees, and that he actually had fusion. So the bones in his feet had actually become kind of one bone. They had all fused together, as you can see here, in both feet. The individual that was discovered with him was burial 12. Now this was a slightly younger man, between the ages of 20 and 30. He again had severe osteoarthritic changes in all of his major joints, knees, elbows, shoulders, but he also presented with skull asymmetry, which was an interesting difference. He also had severe thinning of the bone in many areas and fusion of his wrists, as well as bony destruction of his hands and feet. Now, in both cases, these individuals probably had very limited mobility, especially towards the end of their life, and had very limited manual dexterity as well. So this brings up a lot of questions about perhaps how they would have survived, how perhaps they would have been treated in society, and other things about what their experiences might have been. But what we were trying to do is figure out what these conditions might have been. These are two possibilities. You don't have to read all of these. This is just to prove that I looked it up, I promise. So rheumatoid arthritis, the main features of rheumatoid arthritis is destruction of the joints. In addition to destruction, we have to see symmetrical destruction. So we have symmetry, bilateral destruction in all of the joints, as well as a focus on hands and feet. So those are kind of the key elements of rheumatoid arthritis. Now, juvenile idiopathic arthritis, this bottom one, is really a form of rheumatoid arthritis, but it presents much earlier and is found in juveniles. Again, we have much of the same characteristics, but it's usually much more severe, and we can also have bony changes in the spine and with the skull. So in order to kind of try to diagnose these conditions in these individuals, we went symptom by symptom to try to figure out what was going on. So we first looked at the number of joints that were affected. So we decided that these individuals were polyarthritic, so multiple joints showed arthritic changes. So that ruled out gout, madeuromycosis, infectious arthritis, and traumatic arthritis, which only affect single joints. From there, we looked at if there was fusion to the joints. We did have fusion. So that ruled out most forms of osteoarthritis and post-paralytic paralysis. From there, we looked at whether or not these lesions were symmetrical. So in one case, we know for sure they were. In the other, we're pretty sure they were, but we don't have all the bones. But at least in this instance, symmetrical lesions rule out ankylosing spondylitis, reactive arthropathy, erosive osteoarthritis, and enteropathic arthropathies. And in some cases, juvenile idiopathic arthritis, but that can really go either way. So then we looked at if the distal interphalangeal joints, so the last knuckle in your hands and feet, if those were involved, and if your sacroiliac joint, so the joint between your sacrum and your hip and your lower back. And in one case, we don't have those involved, and we know that they weren't involved because we have those bones, and that was in the older individual, burial 10. So if those are not involved, you know that it could probably be rheumatoid arthritis. So that one we're pretty sure on. The other one, like I said, we don't have all the bones. So instead we looked at whether or not osteopenia, so thinning of the bone, was present, or if skull asymmetry was present. In our case, we did have those things. So that really rules out psoriatic arthritis and leaves us with really one most likely diagnosis, which is juvenile idiopathic arthritis. This is just another way to look at it. We tested about probably 11 different symptoms against maybe 10 or 11 different syndromes to identify that we think rheumatoid arthritis and juvenile idiopathic arthritis correspond most similarly to the individual symptoms that we have here. Rheumatoid arthritis is really difficult to diagnose even in living people without doing some sort of blood test for Rh factor. We can't do that in these individuals. Historically, it just doesn't show up very well in archaeological remains. So is it possible that it was some other form of erosive arthropathy? Absolutely. We think that RA is a likely candidate, but we can't rule out others. In terms of juvenile idiopathic arthritis, we're very certain. No, we're not certain. We very strongly believe that juvenile idiopathic arthritis most well fits the symptoms that we have here. So in conclusion, I want to reinforce that from what I think I've shown, I've proved that Kellis really was a very vibrant and unique settlement. It was an area where traditions mixed between Pharaonic and Greek, and then Greek and Roman different cultures. And because of that, it was a really productive and important administrative, trade, and even religious center. And we know all that from the archaeology. But what we can learn from the bioarchaeology is that these people were also individuals, and they were just as vibrant and just as unique, and each had their own experience. So thank you very much, and I would also like to thank my thesis advisor for letting me work on this material and introducing me to it and giving me some of her slides and pictures. The Dakhleh Oasis project for doing the research, most of it. Monash University for access to images, and Dr. Williams and Dr. Wheeler for access to images and for review. And of course, I'd love to thank the Florida Historical Society Archaeological Institute for inviting me to talk and really for providing this amazing space for reaching out to the public with this academic research. So thank you.